Hello Year 9 and welcome to yet another unbelievably entertaining lesson by me, Miss Lex, on An Inspector Calls. Now we're focusing on Act 1, just the first part today, and this is work for the week commencing the 4th of May 2020. So on the right hand side you can see a little checklist of things that we need to do in today's lesson. So firstly the do now, which is down here. Secondly, I'll talk you through the knowledge organiser. Thirdly, you will need to read Act 1, or at least the first 10 pages. Then we're going to look at the stage directions, the engagement, and Burling's speech. So these are the key events between pages 1 to 10 in the play. So for the do now, I've asked you questions based on the work you did on GCSE Pod last week. So who wrote the play? When was it written? When was it set? 3 major historical events that took place, and the playwright's message to society. So I'd like you to pause the video now and write down your responses. Excellent. So J.B. Priestley is our playwright, and he wrote this in 1945 at the end of World War II. It was set in 1912, and 3 major historical events would be the sinking of the Titanic later in 1912, obviously World War I, which was between 1914 to 1918, and World War II, which was 1939 to 1945. Obviously, there was a lot of other elements in society at that time, but these issues were prominent. And Priestley's message to society was that of equality. Politically, he was a socialist, which meant that he believed in equality and he felt like we should all be responsible for each other. He didn't like the way society was at the time, so this play is almost allegorical in the sense that it has a moral message to it. It's trying to teach us something. You can hear random purring, that's my cat in the background, sorry. So, moving on. On this slide, just for the purposes of my explanation, is a knowledge organiser. Now, I know this will be tiny for you, but it's been uploaded onto both Go for Schools and Microsoft Teams, where you should be able to download it or at least see it in a larger form than here. So, in case you're unfamiliar with the concept of a knowledge organiser, it's effectively an incredibly summarised version of the topic that we're studying. Sorry, that's the cat. So for us, in An Inspector Calls, it's got a very brief outline of the main characters, some key quotations, a condensed summary of what happens in the play overall, some key techniques that Priestley uses, and some contextual knowledge too, which is the stuff you addressed last week. So what I'd like you to do before moving on is to make sure you have access to this and have a look through it, because it'll give you a much better understanding of what it is we're going to be looking at. So pause the video now and go and find that knowledge organiser. Okay. So before we get into the lesson properly, you should have looked at your knowledge organiser, and available on MS Teams is a copy of pages 1 to 10 of the play. I couldn't upload it onto Go for Schools because the document was too big, but you should be able to access it there if you don't have your own copy. So before you even start embarking on the following tasks, I would like you to read those 10 pages, please. If you struggle to access them, just drop me an email or a message on MS Teams and I will fix it for you. So, go read the first 10 pages, pause the video and then come back. Right, you should have had a delightful introduction to the Burling family, Sheila's engagement to Gerald, and Mr. Burling thinking he knows absolutely everything. You should have read up to the point where the doorbell rings, perfectly interrupting his capitalist speech. So before we even start looking at the dialogue in a bit more detail, it's really important to establish the stage directions and what the playwright's intentions were when setting up the stage like this. It's really important to remember that when we're studying a play, it was designed to be performed and watched by an audience, not just to be read. And obviously over this format that's slightly difficult, but we'll do our best. So the stage directions are a really good way of trying to work out the kind of atmosphere that the playwright's trying to establish and what the playwright's intentions were. So we're going to look at those stage directions from An Inspector Calls and try to work out what Priestley is saying about the Burling family. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this slide is read through the stage directions here and then go through the tasks with you. And in your books or on your Word document, what I think would be helpful is for you to write the stage directions as your subheading and then just answer the questions underneath. You don't need to write the questions out if you're going to be responding in full sentences. So I'll take you through by reading the stage directions. At rise of curtain, the four Burlings and Gerald are seated at the table, with Arthur Burling at one end, his wife at the other, Eric downstage, and Sheila and Gerald seated upstage. Edna, the parlour maid, is just clearing the table, which has no cloth, of the dessert plates and champagne glasses, etc., and then replacing them with a decanter of port, cigar box, and cigarettes. Port glasses are already on the table. All five are in evening dress of the period, the men in tails and white ties, not dinner jackets. Arthur Burling is a heavy-looking, rather portentous man in his middle 50s, with fairly easy manners but rather provincial in his speech. His wife is about 50, a rather cold woman, and her husband's social superior. Sheila is a pretty girl in her early 20s, very pleased with life and rather excited. Gerald Croft is an attractive chap about 30, rather too manly to be a dandy, but very much a well-bred young man about town. Eric is in his early 20s, not quite at ease, half shy, half assertive. At the moment, they've all had a good dinner, are celebrating a special occasion, and are pleased with themselves. So try to picture that scene, because that's what Priestley wants his audience to see straight away as soon as the curtains are drawn. So the first task I'd like you to think about is, what impression is Priestley trying to give us of the Burlings here, and why? So you might notice they're a fairly affluent family. They have a parlour maid, which is obviously quite a privilege. It sets them apart as being wealthier. You've got the idea of champagne glasses. You've got the fact they've got port glasses. They're obviously quite a wealthy family. They have all these different types of glasses. They're middle to upper class. They're all dressed in fancy clothes. So we know straight away that they almost come across as being quite smug. You've got this almost ominous clause at the bottom, and they're pleased with themselves, which immediately sets them up for something to change that later. So effectively he's trying to show off that they're rich. If you'd like, in between each task, it might be handy to pause the tape so that you kind of listen to my ideas about a task and then you write down your ideas, but it's totally up to you. Task 2. So here it says Mrs. Burling is Mr. Burling's social superior, and what that means is that she comes from a wealthier family than he does. And that might be quite surprising to us. So she's effectively posher than he is. And what we can gather from this information is that Mr. Burling married Mrs. Burling so that he could move up in his social standing. So where I've said patriarchal society seems like a hideously long word, but all it means is male-dominated. So the men make the rules, women do as they're told. Remember, it's set in 1912. So we can kind of infer that Arthur has married Sybil Burling in order to elevate his social class. Task 3, and you will have to do this one by yourself. I'd like you to write down any words you don't know and make sure you look up their definition and write it down. For example, just glancing over here, you might not know what a decanter is. You might not know what portentous or provincial means. So just reread this. Any words you're unfamiliar with, write them down and look up the definitions. Okay, task 4, what I would like you to do, and bullet points are absolutely fine for this, is write down what we learn about each character. It's really important that we know how Priestley wants to establish these people right at the start of the play. So I've done Arthur Burling here. We know he's heavy looking, he's self-important, he's middle-aged, and he has a local accent. So where his wife Sybil might be speaking a little bit more like this, Arthur's not, and I'm not even going to attempt some sort of Birmingham accent, but I imagine some sort of gentrified Peaky Blinders at this point. So you need to do that for each of the 5 characters. So that's Arthur Burling, Sybil Burling, Sheila Burling, Gerald Croft, and Eric Burling. Task 5 is focusing on why Edna, the parlourmaid, is present in this scene and how is she different. Obviously, we can infer that she's of a lower class, she's a maid, but interestingly, she's also the only character here who doesn't get given a last name, signifying perhaps that she's less important or less significant, highlighting Priestley's views on inequality. And finally, task 6, what do the Burling's possessions tell you about them? So you're going to be wanting to look up here. We know that they're wealthy, but is there anything else you can infer? Is there anything else you can work out from the information? Okay, if you haven't already, you're going to want to pause it here before we move on to the next task. Second section we're going to look at in detail is the engagement between Sheila and Gerald, and we're really going to focus on the ring. So similar to the last slide, oh gosh, I might attempt to read through this, although it really won't have the same effect as having different characters, and then we'll talk about the tasks. So remember, in a play, the stage directions are the bits in brackets, or they're kind of just on their own down here. So Sheila says, "You be careful or I'll start weeping." And Gerald says, "Well, perhaps this will help to stop it." And he gives her a ring. And Sheila says, "Oh, Gerald, you've got it. Is it the one you wanted me to have?" And Gerald says, "Yes, the very one." Sheila takes out the ring and says, "Oh, it's wonderful. Look, Mummy, isn't it a beauty? Oh, darling." She kisses Gerald hastily. Eric says, "Steady, boss." Sheila, who is looking at the ring, says, "I think it's perfect. Now I really feel engaged." And Mrs. Burling says, "So you ought, darling. It's a lovely ring. Be careful with it." And Sheila says, "Careful? I'll never let it go out of my sight for an instant." Mrs. Burling smiles and says, "Well, it came at just the right moment. That was very clever of you, Gerald. Now, Arthur, if you've no more to say, I think Sheila and I had better go into the drawing room and leave you men." And Burling rather heavily responds, "I just want to say this. Are you listening, Sheila? This concerns you too. And after all, I don't often make speeches at you." And Sheila, sufficiently reprimanded, says, "I'm sorry, Daddy, actually I was listening." And he waits before he continues. I hope you appreciate my different voices in this time. So, we see a little bit more of Sheila here. And for task 1, we're looking at how she addresses her parents. She says, "Look, Mummy," and "I'm sorry, Daddy," and that kind of implies to us that, yes, she's in her early 20s, but she's probably quite immature. She maybe even comes across as quite spoilt, quite naive, quite inexperienced. It could also be an indicator of her class. For task 2, I've asked, what do you think the ring symbolises here? And Sheila and Gerald are obviously in a committed relationship, but she needs to have a ring in order to really feel engaged. So I suppose what that tells us is that the Burling family are very focused on material possessions. That's what's important to them. And I suppose that's what Priestley is trying to tell us is bad in society. Now, Eric doesn't say an awful lot here. He just kind of interjects with, "Steady the buffs," like, "Calm down, why are you kissing in public?" And we kind of see that he's almost isolated from the family. Everyone else seems to be getting involved. Eric doesn't say an awful lot at this point. So we see, back to those stage directions where he's described as half shy, half assertive. He doesn't really belong in this situation with his family. He doesn't fit in. Task 4, I've asked you to look at the stage directions that have been highlighted. So that's the bit in bold. And what do they tell you about the atmosphere of the scene? And why is that so important to Priestley? So you've got smiling, excited, hastily, admiringly smiling. It makes everything seem warm and fluffy, doesn't it? Nothing's going wrong. They haven't a care in the world. And it almost sets this family up for failure. We can imagine that something bad is going to happen to interrupt that happiness. And then finally for this one, task 5, Burling holds them a moment before continuing. So we see here how egotistical Mr. Burling is. He is commanding their attention. He won't just carry on now that Sheila said, "I was listening." He waits until he has their full attention 100%. So we know how controlling he is as well. Okay, so if you haven't been pausing as you go, you might want to pause here and write your responses to those 5 tasks. Okay, so the final section we're going to look at in detail is Berlin's speech. And I'll just read this to you. I just want to say this. There's a good deal of silly talk about these days, but, and I speak as a hard-headed businessman who's had to take risks and knows what he's about, I say you can ignore all this silly pessimistic talk. When you marry, you'll be marrying at a very good time. Yes, a very good time. And soon it'll be an even better time. Last month, just because the miners came out on strike, there's a lot of wild talk about possible labour trouble in the near future. Don't worry, we've passed the worst of it. We employers at last are coming together to see that our interests and the interests of capital are properly protected, and we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity. Just because the Kaiser makes a speech or two, or a few German officers have too much to drink and begin talking nonsense, you'll hear some people say that war's inevitable. And to that I say, fiddlesticks. The Germans don't want war. Nobody wants war, except some half-civilised folks in the Balkans. And why? There's too much at stake these days. Everything to lose and nothing to gain by war. I say there isn't a chance of war. The world's developing so fast that it'll make war impossible. Look at the progress we're making. In a year or two, we'll have aeroplanes that will be able to go anywhere. And look at the way the automobile's making headway, bigger and faster all the time. And then ships. Why? A friend of mine went over this new liner last week, the Titanic. She sails next week. 46,800 tons, New York in 5 days, and every luxury. And unsinkable. Absolutely unsinkable. That's what you've got to keep your eye on. Facts like that. Progress like that. And not a few German officers talking nonsense and a few scaremongers here making a fuss about nothing. Now, you three young people, just listen to this and remember what I'm telling you now. In 20 or 30 years' time, let's say in 1940, you may be giving a little party like this. Your son or daughter might be getting engaged, and I tell you, by that time you'll be living in a world that will have forgotten all these capital versus labour agitations and all these silly little war scares. There'll be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere, except of course in Russia, which will always be behindhand naturally. Okay, so that's Berlin's speech. He dominates a lot of the conversation in this act. So the first thing I would like you to do is to write down everything that he gets wrong. And the technique here is dramatic irony. So that's when the audience, so us, we know something that the characters don't. In this case, the play is set in 1912, so we know that Titanic sinks. We know that there are going to be 2 world wars, but the characters don't. So I've given you some examples there, but there are more. So what does Berlin get wrong, and how does Priestley use dramatic irony here? Secondly, what's Priestley hoping to achieve by making Berlin unlikable? It goes back to Priestley's message. So Priestley wanted us all to be more responsible for one another and to care about one another, and he wanted equality. Berlin represents the opposite of this. He represents capitalism, which is the idea that you can kind of earn your own money and progress in that way. And by making Berlin so unlikable and untrustworthy, we don't like him. The audience doesn't trust him, which means that anything he says from now on, we're automatically going to question. And it also opens our mind a little bit more to what the inspector has to say. The inspector and Mr. Berlin are almost like polar opposites here. They're the antithesis of each other. So Priestley is setting us up to disbelieve Berlin from now on. We think he's foolish. Task 3. Eric tries to speak to his father in the speech, but Berlin keeps cutting him off. Why do you think Berlin treats Eric in this way? So I suppose you've got those 2 masculine roles, and you've got Berlin desperate to maintain power over his son Eric. Eric, we know, doesn't fit into his family, but it also shows that Berlin and Eric don't have a particularly close relationship. They're obviously not functioning very well as father and son. And again, Priestley does this intentionally to set up something that's going to happen later. It means that right at the beginning, Priestley has established that Eric and Berlin don't get on particularly well. Berlin doesn't show him any respect. They don't have what you would assume is a typical father-son relationship. And finally, Berlin presents his opinion as fact. So all this stuff he says about the war, I'm telling you in 1940 you'll be having a party, even though we all know that there's a war going on then. what does that tell you about his character? The fact that he always talks as though his opinions are facts. And it shows us how egotistical he is, but also how ignorant he is as well. He's not really willing to listen to other people's points of view. He doesn't want to hear anyone else's opinions, like Eric, for example. He just wants to keep talking and dominate the conversation. And that's the sort of character he is. So, if you didn't pause as I went through, pause it now so you can write your responses. Okay, the final thing I want you to consider for this lesson is what sort of family are the Burlings? How would you characterise them? For someone that's never looked at the play or hasn't read the stage directions, how would you explain the Burling family to that person? And why do you think Priestley presents them this way? I'm not going to talk any more about that because I'd like you to think about that. Last thing. Hopefully, if you do make any notes, you should be able to submit them onto Teams via Class Notebook, which is here on my screen, but I have no idea where it is on yours. So give it a go, and if you have any trouble, just let me know. And thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed my dramatic readings. Take care.